Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session. Hope you've all had a beautiful few days at TWT. First of all, massive thank you and shout out to the World Transformed and everyone involved in organizing it. It's always an amazing event, and every time I come, I'm always blown away of the importance of it and how much political education is happening, really in a vacuum of it in general, in the society we live in. So it's a fantastic thing, and in whatever form it continues, I think it really needs to. So thank you and congratulations again for a great festival. Today we're looking at Latin America, particularly South America specifically, and we wanted to pose a question around what is actually happening in these countries. And we've got speakers from Brazil, Colombia, and Chile to enlighten us today about exactly what the situations are in those countries. Now, we all know that South and Latin America has been a region that has offered so much hope and inspiration for the left for so many decades, and recent years has been no different. We experienced the so-called pink tides from the early 2000s, the arrival of people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, joining Lula in Brazil and Correa in Ecuador in a really hopeful time for the left, a hope to replace the so-called Washington consensus and the domination of US interests in the region for something different, something at the time called the Caracas consensus. There's huge social investment programs in Venezuela and Bolivia, the creation of regional bodies to overcome the domination of the US militarily and economically. But of course, the right, and often the far right, returned to assert itself through coups in Bolivia and so-called lawfare or soft coups in Brazil and Ecuador. From Lula, Chavez, Morales, and Correa, we moved to a time of Duque in Colombia, Bolsonaro, Piñera, and short-lived, thankfully, Janine Áñez. An alliance of far-right to neoliberal leaders reasserted themselves in South America. But once again today, and over the last few years, the left, in different forms and different to before, has been able to reorganize itself and gain electoral power across several South American countries. Some may call it a new pink tide. But it's a very different moment, and the governments have very different components and makeups. So today we're going to look at Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. Firstly, of course, to draw inspiration from left victories, and we always need hope and to see examples of where left can be successful. But we also want to ask some more complex questions. We want to ask about what these governments are actually able to do in practice, about what is actually being achieved in power from a left perspective, and what the consequences are for a left project of entering into coalitions, governing with opposition Congress, and needing the support of more centrist forces. We're going to start with Brazil. ¿Estás lista? Okay, we're going to start with Colombia. Lista? Okay. Well, Colombia is a bit easier for me to introduce because I spend a lot of time working on Colombia. Colombia has long been the bastion of US interests in Colombia. Throughout changes that might have happened in other countries, Colombia has always been governed by the right or the far right throughout its history. Decades of armed conflict and state-backed violence. After a peace process in 2012 to 2016 was followed by the election of the far-right government of Ivan Duque, large protests and extremely violent responses from the Colombian police set the scene for the election last summer of Gustavo Petro and Francia Márquez, the country's first ever progressive government backed by trade unions and social movements. But in Congress, to gain a majority, a coalition had to be built with centrist traditional parties, including the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. So to offer us an analysis of the first 18 months of the Petro government and where we're at today in Colombia, we have with us Ana Maria Cepeda. She's a teacher trade unionist. She works with the Teacher Trade Union Federation, FECODE, the largest union in Colombia. And she works particularly around trade union education and helping the union developed these. She's with us this week. She's going to be speaking as well at the NEU International Conference on Saturday. So thanks so much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you.
Bueno, muy buenos días. 8 minutos, qué corto para todo lo que hay que decir. Agradecer la invitación, la presencia. No quisiera iniciar la intervención sin pronunciarme, y espero no estar errando en el espacio, sin pronunciarme con vehemencia frente a los actos desproporcionados y brutales de Israel en contra del Estado de Palestina. Es necesario mencionarlo.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Well, they've given me 8 minutes to speak, or that was 15 with translation. I just want to say thank you to you all for this invitation to speak here. But before I start, I would like to just express my condemnation of what Israel is conducting against the Palestinians and my support for the Palestinian people.
Nuestra solidaridad con el pueblo palestino. Bueno, agradecer la invitación. Tenemos un momento muy esperanzador en Colombia. Hemos atravesado por más de 214 años de barbarie, de muerte, de miseria, de paramilitarismo, de exterminio, de asesinato sistemático a la oposición. Hemos tenido que salir, y hoy nos recordaban en el Congreso cómo hemos tenido que salir con esquemas de seguridad, con chalecos antibalas para poder sentar nuestra voz de oposición y de resistencia ante un sistema, por supuesto, capitalista, dependiente y arrasador. Toca cortar.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a hopeful moment in Colombia. After 214 years of what we can only say was barbarism, of poverty, of suffering, of paramilitarism, of the systematic targeting and killing of opposition, activists, politicians, leaders, and so on. The norm in Colombia is that we're unable to go out without security schemes, without bulletproof vests, just because we show resistance to the dominant system. And this is a capitalist system which has dominated our lives for a very long time.
Hemos gestado una suma de procesos organizativos en los territorios con la gente que nos ha costado vidas, bastantes vidas en los territorios perdidas a cuenta del paramilitarismo. Se ha organizado una suma de acciones populares de resistencia en los territorios más alejados de la capital, que nos ha permitido lograr consolidar un ejercicio de organización y de lucha que luego de lo que llamaron algunos teóricos el estallido social, y creo que me excusan ustedes que ya lo han escuchado varias veces hoy, no queremos referirnos a él como un estallido social. El estallido es espontáneo y no es organizado. El estallido es transitorio, no proyecta una política. Queremos llamar entonces a esto un acumulado de lucha.
Sorry to those who speak Spanish for the delay. Throughout all this time, we've been managing and carrying out organizational processes, particularly in rural regions and those places that are far from the capital and the big urban centers. Even still, these processes have cost lives because of the paramilitaries that are present all over Colombia. But you know, our actions have been organizing resistance, organizing struggle, and this, a couple of years ago, this led to what many people call a social explosion. But I prefer to not use the term social explosion, because an explosion is something that happens spontaneously. It is not an organized process. And what's happened in Colombia is the product of organization and transitory processes. And I prefer to use the term an accumulation of struggles, of different struggles from different areas.
Este ejercicio organizado, rebelde, de resistencia, que se expresó con la mayor beligerancia posible en los territorios y que costó vidas. Creo que las cifras ya ustedes las conocen muy bien. Los estudiantes, jóvenes, niños, adultos, atacados brutalmente. No puedo dejar pasar la experiencia que tuvimos en FECODE, que hicimos una caravana hacia el paro en Cali. Atravesar el país no fue fácil, los gobernadores inclusive nos cerraron la puerta de los departamentos para poder ingresar. Llevábamos solidaridad y era una carga de desesperanza donde el pueblo no tenía nada que perder. Había ancianos, niños, jóvenes con machetes, con palos, en resistencia.
So as I said, these were organizational processes of rebellion, of resistance, which cost us lives. And you're probably familiar with the figures for if you follow Justice for Colombia's work, the level of brutality that the state at the time meted out to people. And these, students, young people were brutally attacked. This is in 2021 as they protested against the neoliberal system. And in our trade union, FECODE, the teachers' union, we did a caravan, a kind of humanitarian solidarity caravan to the city of Cali, because Cali was the epicenter of the protests. It's where the repression was most intense. But it wasn't easy just to cross the country, just to get to Cali. The government at the time tried to prevent people moving around. It tried to prevent and block these signs of solidarity. But the people had nothing to lose. And so what we saw was young people, old people crossing the country, resisting the state, using sticks, using the machetes that they use in the countryside to say, no, enough of this system.
Cuanto mayor fue la represión, mayor fue la resistencia. Y eso nos permitió concretar un momento histórico en la democracia de nuestro país que muy limitada así es. Y es lograr en las urnas, no con la mayoría aplastante que hubiéramos querido, el gobierno del pacto histórico como proyecto político. Y quisiera mencionar eso con énfasis porque el proyecto político es lo que encargan a Gustavo Petro, ¿sí? Y por supuesto tendremos que pensar en quién pueda proyectar esa tarea más adelante, porque estos 4 años ya se nos pasaron y las contradicciones de clase se hacen cada día más fuertes para poder avanzar en las reformas estructurales que hemos propuesto, que se ha propuesto el gobierno nacional.
So the more repression there was, the more resistance there was. The resistance grew from the repression. And this took us to what was a historic moment in Colombia, an extraordinary historic moment, that we were able to elect a progressive government for the first time in our history. People expressed their opposition to the dominant system when they went to vote. And we elected the Historic Pact coalition, which today is in government in Colombia. This is a political project, and it's a political project that crosses society, that has sectors from many backgrounds. But we must be aware, we need to have a long-term plan, a strategy to how we're going to take this forwards, because President Petro, the first progressive president in our history, the first left-wing president in our history, he only has 4 years in office, and it's almost a year and a half gone already. So we need to be thinking, what happens next? Where do we go with this? Particularly because Colombia, there is still a lot of class contradiction, a lot of class tension, as a dominant class tries to push back against the grassroots. And this is particularly evident in the social reforms to tackle inequality that the government is putting forward.
5 reformas estructurales ha propuesto el gobierno de Gustavo Petro. El Estado colombiano tiene una estructura bastante difícil de permear con reformas que favorezcan a la población. La estructura del Estado está pensada para favorecer a las élites, al gran empresariado, al sector financiero. Mover esa estructura ha sido bastante difícil, más aún cuando los ministerios tienen en sus mandos medios y en los funcionarios que ejecutan la política todavía enquistado el centro democrático, la política uribista y paramilitar. Avanzar en esas reformas desde el Estado mismo ha sido bastante complejo, más aún en el paso por el legislativo, que requiere 8 debates cada proyecto de ley, 4 en Cámara, 4 en Senado, con un Congreso de derecha.
So the government, as it seeks to tackle the inequality in Colombia, has presented 5 structural reforms to the current system. But these are very difficult to put forwards because the system in Colombia was not designed to benefit the people. It was designed to benefit the dominant class, the big groups, the economically powerful, and so on. You know, ministers, powerful ministers, they still control sections of the media. The media is in oligarchic hands. Particularly the far-right political party, the Democratic Center, which was formed by the former president Álvaro Uribe, who is a hard-right, very militaristic president whose administration saw very high human rights abuses and close ties to paramilitaries. So it's very difficult to take these advances forwards, particularly legislatively, because we don't have a majority in Congress, and there are many debates which have to take place in both the Senate and the lower house.
Estas 5 reformas son la reforma a la salud, la reforma laboral, la reforma pensional, la reforma rural integral agraria y la reforma estatutaria a la educación, todas garantizando derechos. En el sistema económico capitalista, no en su modelo de acumulación, y eso quiero dejarlo claro porque he escuchado varias veces frente al neoliberalismo y el neoliberalismo no, el neoliberalismo es el modelo de acumulación de un sistema y es el sistema capitalista el que determina las condiciones de explotación. Y en ese orden de ideas, garantizar derechos en un sistema económico capitalista es una fuga en la economía. No es algo que sea susceptible de debatirse dentro del sistema, pero nosotros estamos en pie de lucha para que sea un elemento a debatir a pesar de la dependencia de Colombia.
So there are 5. Yeah. There are five principal reforms, areas of reform: healthcare, labor reform, pensions reform, comprehensive rural reform, educational reform, and the common link between them all is that they guarantee rights. They guarantee the rights of the people. But, you know, we have a neoliberal capitalist system, you know, whatever you call it, is essentially a capitalist system, and it is based in the exploitation of working people in Colombia, and that is at the essence of everything we are opposing and trying to change.
En ese orden de ideas, avanzar no es fácil, pasan por el legislativo, sin embargo nosotros creemos que dado que el poder todavía reside en el mismo lugar, no ha cambiado su estado, no nos queda de otra que hacer un ejercicio legítimo del poder popular en las calles. Es sobre la base de esa legitimación de las reformas en las calles que vamos a poder avanzar. Hace una semana, cierro la idea, hace una semana hubo una marcha multitudinaria cuestionada por la derecha, pues porque se le endilgaba al gobierno haber pagado para llenar la Plaza de Bolívar. Es imposible pagar tanta plata para llenar las plazas de Bolívar en todo el país.
So, as I said, you know, it's not been easy to advance with these measures, with these reforms, particularly in legislative areas, because, as I said, there's not a Congress. You know, and so there's still a lot of power still lies with the right in Colombia. But what we have is a government that, unlike previous governments, encourages people to take to the streets, encourages mass mobilization. It wants us to go out. It wants us to express ourselves, particularly in support of these reforms. And this was something that we saw 1 week ago when the government called big mobilizations across Colombia, and we saw a huge number of people take to the streets to show their support for what the government's trying to do. And of course, like always, the right wing criticizes them. They try to delegitimize them by saying, for example, that the government paid people to go out and protest. But there is not enough money in Colombia to pay how many people went out to take to the streets to show their support. You know, so what the government says, sorry, not what the opposition, the right wing opposition is saying, was false.
Y nos están preguntando, bueno, ¿y entonces qué está haciendo Gustavo Petro mientras no le aprueban las reformas? ¿Se sentó a mirar para el techo? ¿Qué ha hecho? Bueno, pues se ha ocupado de solucionar situaciones urgentes en la economía de nuestro país. Teníamos el dólar más alto de la historia en los últimos 15 años. Llegó a tener 5.350 pesos. Eso es que una libra vale 5.300 pesos. Pero ¿cómo? ¿En dólares? Ok, no, pues sí, ahí ya. Es caro, muy caro, expensive. Muy caro el dólar. Y la deuda externa se paga en dólares. Eso implica un nivel en la inflación brutal que elevó los precios de la comida, que elevó los precios de la gasolina. Aparte, el gobierno anterior nos dejó una deuda que no había pagado con los subsidios a la gasolina, mientras un galón de gasolina en Estados Unidos vale $4, en Colombia valía $1.50, $2, y eso pues deja una brecha en el subsidio bastante alto. Te dejo un dicho antes de pasar a la siguiente idea, y es que la oposición no solo raspó la olla, se la llevó en los hombros. No raspó la olla, se la llevó en los hombros.
So what's Gustavo Petro been doing, you know, as his reforms find themselves facing tough opposition? Well, he's trying to look for urgent solutions to the economic difficulties that the country is having. The Colombian peso is at its lowest compared to the US dollar ever. You know, a dollar is the same with pounds. You know, pounds and dollars are much higher than they used to be. So life has got very expensive. Inflation is brutal. Food, petrol. The previous government didn't deal with any of the debt that it had. It didn't provide subsidies. And you know, whereas a litre of petrol used to cost like $4 in the US, it would cost $1 or $2 in Colombia because of the subsidies. That has the previous government took that away, and that contributed to the inflation.
Bueno, ¿y qué ha, digamos, logrado en estos últimos días? No quiero irme sin dejar los retos porque creo que el tiempo ya se hace corto. Pero sí quisiera comentar que Gustavo Petro ha tenido una lucha frontal contra el narcotráfico. Es una enfermedad de muchos años en Colombia que nos ha dejado una larga historia de asesinato, de muerte, y el paramilitarismo mismo enquistado con la clase política en favor del narcotráfico. Hoy ese ejercicio ha dejado un 600%, dice portafolio, un 600% de incautaciones de droga, cocaína, marihuana, bueno, han incautado lo que no habían incautado antes en comparación con años anteriores, y por supuesto eso ha traído también la destrucción de laboratorios, la sustitución de los cultivos, que es tan importante para el campesinado colombiano, se ha fortalecido.
So some of the other stuff that's been happening is the obviously drugs trafficking. As you're probably aware, Colombia has high levels of drugs trafficking. This is a historical sickness. It's a very long history, you know, and it's created many problems for our society. It's generated killings. Paramilitaries have expanded massively because of the drugs trade, but it's always been tied to the political class. But since Petro took over, we've seen So since Petro took over, we've seen a 600% rise in seizures of drugs. You know, so the government is doing so much more to tackle it. Marijuana, cocaine. We've seen the destruction of cocaine-producing laboratories, but also, and this one is very important, programs in place for voluntary substitution of crops in Colombia, which means that the communities that economically depend on growing coca now receive state support to transition to legal crops, to alternative crops, so that they have alternative means of survival.
Gustavo Petro y Francia Márquez han logrado un fortalecimiento de la educación pública, digna, y en el caso específico de la educación superior es un privilegio. En Colombia es un privilegio acceder a la educación superior, y el gobierno de Gustavo Petro ha fortalecido la política de educación a partir de la reforma estatutaria de la educación que está en debate hoy, pero que sin duda pues su sola apuesta de garantizarle como derecho fundamental es inédito y muy importante. Ha dado fin y pago a los créditos del ICETEX, que lleva los recursos públicos a las universidades privadas para que una persona que se gradúa de la educación superior termina pagando una deuda de 20, 30 años después de que se ha graduado de las universidades. Ha planteado la matrícula cero, y eso es muy importante, no pagar para poder estudiar en la universidad superior, en la educación superior. Y por supuesto abrir más de 500.000 cupos adicionales en la educación superior. Más o menos calculamos que unos 68% de los estudiantes que se gradúan de la educación media no entran a la educación superior.
Okay, so I'm a teacher trade unionist. So what is Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, the vice president, doing? They're trying to strengthen the education system in terms of public education, decent education. For a very long time, to go into university, to go into higher education has been a privilege. Gustavo Petro has presented reforms. The education reform is actually being debated today, and it basically presents education as a fundamental right. It ends the channeling, or it proposes to end the channeling of public resources into private institutions. It confronts the massive debts that people graduate with. Some graduate debt, people are still paying it 20 to 30 years after finishing. And it proposes free education, free university education. There's 500,000 additional places for free education. Just to give you an idea, around 68% of people who finish school don't go on to university. So the education bill reform really looks to expand people's access to university.
Bueno, el tiempo es cortito, se nos quedan varios elementos que permiten proyectar, digamos, lo que ha venido haciendo el gobierno de Gustavo Petro, pero no quiero cerrar sin antes plantear la importancia del momento político en Colombia. Un gobierno progresista, alternativo, pero que en las condiciones de la ultraderecha guerrerista, mafiosa de nuestro país es casi que un gobierno revolucionario, y hemos de defenderlo, hemos de abrazarlo internacionalmente. Porque de no ser así, muy seguramente la derecha enquistada en el poder va a insistir en bajar a Gustavo Petro antes de los 4 años y de gestar un golpe blando. Entonces, digamos que la solicitud que quisiera hacer con esta generosidad que ha tenido el Reino Unido de escucharnos y de hacer eco de nuestra solicitud es que en efecto abracemos el gobierno de Gustavo Petro, defendamos su política progresista y exijamos en donde quiera que estemos, como exigimos justicia para Palestina con la justa proporción, que exijamos que se respete la democracia en Colombia y que se garantice el avance en las reformas estructurales que el pueblo exige hoy. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay, so I don't want to finish without just emphasizing that this is a very, very important moment in Colombia. You know, we have in place a government that is progressive. It's an alternative government. It's a progressive government. And what it faces is a ultra-right that is basically a mafia and has historically dominated in Colombia. And in that context of the governments we have historically had in Colombia, we can say that the government today is almost a revolutionary government, because in terms of Colombian history, it's almost revolutionary. And that's why I ask, you know, my final solicitude to you is that internationally we embrace the government and we support the government, what it's trying to do. Because we're also very aware that there is a right wing, a powerful right wing that wants to remove Petro before his 4 years is up through a soft coup. So I'm asking you, you know, and I'm grateful for all the generosity that I've received here in the UK since I arrived from people like yourselves, that from the international community, you support Petro, you embrace what his government is trying to do in Colombia. You know, in the same way that we should demand justice for Palestine, I also ask that you demand democracy and the much-needed reform and support for the much-needed reforms that will improve people's lives in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, and sorry for cutting your rhythm for the translation so often, and thanks to Nick for remembering everything. We're going to move to Chile now, quickly moving on, you know, and if we think about Chile, it's had somewhat of a political roller coaster over recent years. The test ground historically for neoliberal economic policies after the coup that brought in Pinochet. In recent years, we saw the huge protests in 2019 that caught the eyes of international attention. And this was during the period of Sebastián Piñera, the right-wing president of Chile at the time. And after those protests, we saw the referendum for a vote to change the constitution, which was passed over 2019 and 2020. And then the arrival in 2021 of a broad coalition, including left-wing forces, that brought Boric to power, again without a majority in Congress. So we're here today with Pablo Navarrete, who can fill us in more about what is actually happening in Chile in the context of the Boric government and that coalition that has brought him to power and the opposition Congress. Pablo is a British-Chilean journalist and documentary filmmaker. He's a founding editor of Alvarado.net, which is an independent voice on Latin American politics, media and culture. Pablo.
Thanks, Hassan, and thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and to Justice for Colombia for organizing this panel, and to TWT for once again having a panel on the left in Latin America. I know we're living in, if you're a socialist, if you're a progressive, however you want to define yourself, we're living in dark times. Certainly, I don't think the horizon in Britain is particularly hopeful. So Latin America, as Hassan said at the beginning, is a region where the left has been winning. But I think it's also good that we take a sober look at what's taking place in these different countries. And as Hassan said, I'm British Chilean. And the reason I'm British is because my parents were forced to leave Chile by 1975. They'd both left after spending time in the concentration camps of Pinochet after the coup on the 11th of September 1973, and we've just marked the 50th anniversary of that coup. So, you know, the Chilean experience was one which marked, was a big deal, I guess, for the European and left and for the Anglo left because of who Allende was, a parliamentary democracy, Chile, all the characteristics. And the idea is not to dwell on that, but I think there's one facet of what happened and the brutality of the coup, 40,000 tortured, 200,000 forced into exile, around up to 2 million that went voluntarily in a population of 11 million, massive percentage. And I think there's one facet of that which is important perhaps in understanding what's going on in Chile today, in that there was a generation of the left that was physically eliminated. Leaders, political leaders of the parties My parents were in the MIR, a party that inspired by the Cuban Revolution, but the Communist Party, who are in government today as part of that coalition. There is a generation that was wiped out. And so what you've had with Gabriel Boric coming to power in March 2022, and I was there filming in Chile at the time, actually filming a documentary with Double Down News that you can see on their YouTube channel. Jeremy Corbyn had been invited to the inauguration. I don't think they'll mind me saying this. That documentary was meant to be more about the Boric government, about this new, young government of young people, of students. But in the end, already by the time we were editing it, we were getting sort of feedback that things weren't already going well. And I think the point I've lost was that generation that was physically eliminated means that there's no natural bridge from this new generation of student leaders that exploded on the scene, of which Boric was one in 2011, with this big protest for free education. And it was these single-issue protests which characterized Chile post-democracy, post-1990. But it took up until November 2019 with the explosion of this mass uprising, a rebellion essentially against the system. And I think we shouldn't idealize that it was, millions of people harking back to Allende. There were elements of that in the street, but it was also just a rage against a system that was oppressing, that was making people having to work multiple jobs, which didn't provide pensions, which, in Chile today, the supermarket is as expensive, if not more expensive than in England, where the minimum wage is $300. So this was a kind of explosion of rage against the system, perhaps similar to what happened in Venezuela in 1989 in the Caracazo, an anti-neoliberal rebellion. So Boric comes from a student generation of young people and has inherited, I guess, his success electorally is not directly linked, but obviously that discontent provided the context for Boric's eventual victory. Now, this new generation are very different to, I guess, what would consider the old left in Chile, but elsewhere. And I think in government, some of the challenges or failures, if you want to call them that, maybe speak to that youth and that naivety, perhaps, that characterizes Boric. I think the focus with Boric, and he's certainly symptomatic of a new left in Latin America, and he's been very vocal about his government representing a kind of more ecological, a more feminist approach to leftist politics in the region, and I think that's certainly something to be welcomed. But at the same time, a criticism I would give is that he's thrown, he's kind of turned his back on the old left in Latin America to such a degree that sometimes there's a critique in Chile from a kind of older generation, and certainly from an exile community in the UK where I live, and I don't live in Chile, so my observations are certainly as someone from outside who travels there, and I was there in June, and I spoke to a number of people, is that this focus on identity politics is perhaps also the cause of why this constitution that was massively rejected, if we're honest, in September last year, was rejected because there doesn't seem to be, with the Boric government, a grand narrative that speaks to the masses in Chile, to the workers, to the kind of, perhaps what enthused people under the popular unity. So I think whilst it's welcoming to see the commitments to the environment, to the fact that 14 out of the 24 ministers in his first cabinet were women, I think Boric has perhaps tried to be too novel, to recreate what it means to be a left-winger in Latin America today. And I think we see that when it comes to foreign policy in Latin America. I think it's been a real shame, to put it mildly, that the Chilean government was an early endorser, if not endorser, but accepted the coup regime in Peru. Although people can debate what happened, I think, at the end of the day, there wasn't, there was a removal of a president, of a left-wing president in Latin America, and the Boric government refused even to sign a statement that Colombia, Mexico, and two others signed, which was quite soft, really. It wasn't a condemnation per se, but Boric has systematically distanced himself from even the mildest sort of statements done by the region. So I think we see this also. I mean, we don't have time, but we see this approach certainly if we look at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and Boric has been a kind of outspoken ally of Zelensky to the extent where there's been a broad consensus amongst the left in Latin America to kind of, Lula's shown a kind of a leadership position on this in Brazil to look for a peaceful solution, to not explicitly take sides. But Boric, again, has kind of extricated himself from a kind of regional leftist approach to this and looked to sort of endorse Zelensky's side in this conflict explicitly, to the extent that Lula very, I think, diplomatically, but it was clear that he was rebuking him at a recent CELAC EU Congress in Brussels recently, where Boric, tried to get a statement in favor of Ukraine, and Lula put it down to his youthfulness. But I think there was a very clear message that Lula was saying to, just to hold off. So I think, I'm sorry if I'm not going to here to present this the narrative around the youngest president in the world who's transforming Chile. But the reality, and my recent trip to Chile was one where I came away thinking that the left is not in a good place in Chile. Yes, there have been certain advances. Yes, Boric, in his inaugural speech, I remember very clearly he spoke about his commitment to the region, his commitment to Latin America, to continue the tradition of Allende in terms of the Latin American brothers and sisters. But I find that with Boric, there's a lot of rhetoric that's not matched up by action. And I think that people are increasingly becoming disillusioned, and his supporters. And then the final thing I want to say, and maybe we can continue the discussion, is that another interesting aspect of this focus on identity is that Boric, and perhaps because of the generation, I think sees himself more as a kind of Eurocentric left. And I think he actually said this when he came to Europe recently, that he identified more with the left traditions in Europe. I mean, his own background from university is from a kind of libertarian left, and perhaps that also explains the kind of uneasy tension that there is in this coalition of coalitions that includes the Communist Party. But he himself comes from a more middle-class background. Perhaps the difference between Petro and Lula, part two, obviously Lula is back in power, is that these leaders are experienced. They come, in Petro's case, a former guerrilla of the M19. In Lula's case, a former trade union leader. There is a kind of, these figures are rooted in a level of organization and leftist struggle that I don't think that Boric and those from his generation come. He was a student leader for 1 year at the University of Chile. Then he went directly to be a congressman from 2014 to 2022. And now he's the president at the age of 36. And I think that there is, as I say, from my side, there is a kind of an inability, and I don't want to underestimate, just to say, I don't want to just come here and just, be an, unrelenting critic of Boric, because I don't want to underestimate what the institutional impediments that exist in Chile are. I mean, the right are, I would argue, as powerful as they've ever been. And post-coup, the domination of the institutions and their refusal to allow even the most timid reform, I don't think, is a real thing. But I think, for example, I was speaking to independent media actors, one from a new media outlet called La Voz de los que Sobran, and I asked about media reform, because I think Chile, in any country, and I think Lula himself suffered from this, the inability of left-wing governments to democratize media landscape and to accept that the private media will give them a full frontal attack. We saw it with Corbyn in the UK. But there's been next to no media reform in Chile. And this is something that at the end of the day, the right-wing media, the mainstream media will always, even though Boric might not be the revolutionary that so many in Chile want, he's still he's still in Chile, I think, not the preferred option for the establishment. And they will weaponize real concerns over crime, over corruption, and the government will be on the reactive. And so I think ultimately, I think Chile is in a difficult place. I think Boric will be judged perhaps by the failure of the constitutional process, and this, we're at a stage now where it looks like this new constitution that the far right, a new far right party, is kind of has controlled in many ways, or the right has controlled, will be rejected in December, and this will, I think Boric has said that he will only really have 2 constitutional processes under his mandate. So, and I think he said himself that he wanted to be judged on how this constitution passed or not. And unless something changes, it looks like that will be a failure. And so maybe the harsh judgment at the end of the Boric government will be that, in that sense, he hasn't really achieved the aspirations and the hope that so many put into him, such as myself and others.
Thank you, Pablo. From Colombia to Chile and now to Brazil. And of course, Brazil, as the largest economic power in South America and in the region, whatever happens in Brazil is extremely important, regionally as well as, of course, internationally. After Lula and Rousseff were removed from power, Brazil lived several years of the far-right government of Bolsonaro, before once again we saw the return of Lula at the start of this year. I was talking to Bella yesterday just to understand the latest sort of components of the governing coalition. And again, there's support in Congress from a broad coalition, which reaches beyond the left into the center and even the center-right to sustain the support for Lula in Congress. So Bella, we're really excited to have you here with us today. Bella Gonçalves is a Brazilian politician. She's also an activist, 15 years as an activist in the housing movement and the landless rights movement. And in 2017 became member of the municipal parliament in Belo Horizonte. How's my Portuguese? Good, nice. In 2021, she was also elected to be part of the Minas Gerais state parliament. She's a member of the PSOL party, a left-wing partner of the Lula government, and she's municipal president of the party in the region of Belo Horizonte. So very excited to have you here with us and to hear the very latest from Brazil and what we might realistically be able to hope for from this Lula government.
Thank you, Hassan. I would like to thank you and Justice for Colombia and Rosa Luxemburg for organizing this event. It's an honor to be here with Maria Eugenia. I'm a big fan of Francia Marques. I think the slogan, "Hay que vivir sabroso," is the best one in politics. Hay que vivir sabroso. And I'm a very fan of Chilean people and Boric as well. So it's very good to be here with you and to be here with all of you. I will speak in Portuguese. Acho que a primeira coisa que é importante dizer
The first thing that is important to highlight
é que a América Latina
is that South America
é um continente onde o surrealismo se confunde com a realidade.
it's a continent where the surrealism gets meddled with the reality sometimes.
Isso era o que dizia o Garcia Souza Marques.
This is what Garcia Souza Marques used to say.
Ele falava que ele não podia descrever a América Latina se ele não conseguisse escrever de forma surreal.
He used to say that he couldn't describe South America unless he described it in that way.
E também é um continente, uma região do mundo que luta há muitos anos pela soberania.
And it's a continent as well that has been fighting for sovereignty for many, many years.
Então, em primeiro lugar, a soberania dos processos coloniais.
So first of all, the sovereignty of colonial processes.
E também, depois, sobre a soberania do imperialismo.
And also, afterwards, the sovereignty over colonialism.
Então, é importante registrar que
So
o ciclo de governos progressistas no início dos anos 2000
It's important to highlight that the cycle of progressive governments in the beginning of the 2000s
se deveu muito a um respiro que a região teve em função de um giro do interesse imperialista norte-americano para o Oriente Médio.
owed a lot to
deixa... Eu falei que...
Fala de novo.
Ok,
Bebiu
ok.
muito álcool.
Eu falei que o ciclo de governos
The
progressistas
cycle of the progressive governments,
foi possível
it was only possible
porque houve um respiro
because there was a breather
em função do interesse imperialista norte-americano estar no Oriente Médio.
relating to the interest of the North American government being in the Middle East.
E também graças à luta do povo, que essa nunca parou.
And also thanks to the fight of the people that has never stopped.
E se nesse primeiro ciclo de governos progressistas, o nosso desafio era construir governos altamente transformadores,
If our biggest challenge or first challenge was to build this kind of government in this first cycle,
transformadores,
transformational,
é importante dizer que a gente também encontrou grandes limites para fazer reformas estruturais.
it's also important to say that we also found lots of limitations to bring that transformation.
Por exemplo, o
For
governo do
example,
Lula resolveu, de fato, retirou o povo brasileiro da fome.
Lula's government, in fact, took people out of hunger,
Construiu mais de 5 milhões de moradias populares.
built over 5 million popular homes,
Colocou os filhos da classe trabalhadora e a população negra na universidade.
put the children of the black population in university, the working population in university.
Mas também ele não conseguiu fazer reformas estruturais como a reforma agrária.
But he wasn't able to do some reformations like the agricultural reformation
E também a reforma urbana.
and also the urban reformation.
E a gente teve um ciclo de arrefecimento, de diminuição das lutas e da organização popular.
And we had a cycle where those fights, those popular strives decreased.
E esse terreno virou um terreno fértil, com a crise econômica, para o ascenso da direita.
And that soil became a fertile soil for the ascension of the right government.
A gente tem que compreender que a extrema-direita no Brasil tem alguns componentes.
We have to understand that the extreme right in Brazil has some components.
Um primeiro componente é um componente ideológico religioso.
The first component is a religious, ideologic component.
Que está presente em todos os lugares do Brasil com o ascenso da religião neopentecostal.
That is present all over Brazil with the increase of the new Pentecostal movement.
Também a presença e a força que o militarismo tem na região e que nunca deixou de ter em função da ausência de reparação sobre a ditadura militar.
And also the presence that the military has there that has never actually lost 100% the power due to the lack of preparation.
Da ditadura militar.
The restoration of the military restoration.
Não, restauração não, a justiça.
Justice.
Tá. Também acho que um componente claro, neoliberal, incomodado principalmente com os direitos trabalhistas no Brasil.
Also something that is obvious is the disturbance about the rights, the labor rights in Brazil,
Dos neoliberais.
of the neoliberal people.
Esses três elementos conjugados
These three elements come together.
estão por trás do golpe contra Dilma,
They are behind the coup against Dilma,
da prisão do Lula
the Lula's incarceration,
e também da vitória do Bolsonaro,
and also Bolsonaro's victory.
que embora não fosse o plano A, o primeiro plano das elites,
Although it wasn't the first plan of the elite,
ganhou muita força
became very strong
devido à descrença da população na política.
due to a lack of belief by the population into politics.
Então é importante dizer que para os brasileiros,
So it's important to say that for the Brazilian people,
o discurso antipolítica é de direita.
the common speech, political speech is of the right.
Não, o discurso antipolítico.
The speech against politics, anti-politics, is of the right.
Porque ele é um componente do bolsonarismo e da crise institucional que a gente vive.
Because it's part of this Bolsonarism, those systems that support Bolsonarism.
Isso. Isso faz com que, cada vez mais,
This makes that every day more,
mais movimentos sociais e novos atores políticos
more social movements and political reactors
decidiram ocupar a política.
decided to occupy, to take part in politics.
Ocupar é diferente de participar.
Occupy or take part is different from participating.
Participar é se contentar com a lógica hegemônica.
Participating is being happy with.
Não, não é being happy. Está conformado com a
It's to
lógica.
be conformed with the logical.
Enquanto ocupar é confrontar a lógica hegemônica.
While really being part of it is to confront, is to come against that.
E eu acho que essa retomada das lutas sociais e das estratégias
And I think that this taking over again of these strategies
dos povos
of
indígenas,
the indigenous people,
do movimento negro,
the movement, the black movement,
das mulheres,
of the women,
foi central para a eleição de Lula no ano passado.
it was crucial for Lula's election last year.
Lula foi eleito a partir de uma recomposição de uma coalizão de centro no Brasil.
Lula was elected through a new coalition that was made central in Brazil.
Não, uma coalizão de centro-direita.
A coalition of right, formed by mainly the right parties in Brazil.
Mas que ainda assim tinha na sua cabeça, na sua origem, um ideal de esquerda.
Even though it still had as a drive, a left drive.
Então, hoje, nós nos encontramos com alguns desafios do governo Lula.
So today we are faced with some challenges of the Lula government.
O primeiro deles
The first of them
é derrotar,
is to defeat,
eliminar,
to eliminate,
não permitir que volte jamais
not permit that is never coming back,
Bolsonaro e os bolsonaristas.
Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism.
No primeiro mês de governo Lula,
In the first month of Lula's government,
ele teve que enfrentar uma tentativa de golpe,
he had to face an attempt of coup again,
onde os extremistas,
whereas the extremists,
depois de pedir por intervenção militar e ocupar a porta dos quartéis,
after requesting an intervention of the military and taking over the army places,
they didn't take over, eles acamparam em frente.
they camped and put camp outside these places.
Fizeram a destruição de todos os prédios da República Brasileira.
They vandalized and destroyed a lot of the public buildings in Brazil.
Então, fazer hoje justiça, defender a democracia,
So today, to implement justice and to implement democracy,
desmontar as células de extrema direita,
to put an end to these cells of the extreme right, of these systems of the extreme right,
e também fazer Bolsonaro responder pelos seus crimes,
and also ensure that Bolsonaro answers for his crimes,
porque houve crimes.
because there were crimes.
Bolsonaro se instalou para destruir o Estado brasileiro.
Bolsonaro got established to destroy the Brazilian state.
Não é à toa que nós tivemos 700 mil pessoas mortas pela Covid.
So much so we had over 700,000 people that died through COVID.
Enquanto ele fazia propaganda anti-vacina
While he was promoting the anti-vaccination campaign
e colocando os militares no Ministério da Saúde.
and implementing militaries in the Ministry of Health.
E, internacionalmente,
Internationally,
ele isolou o Brasil.
he isolated Brazil.
Fez relações estranhas
He made some weird relationships
com países de extrema direita.
with countries of extreme right,
E agora ele está respondendo
and now he's answering
na justiça,
in the justice, with justice,
pela venda e contrabando de joias
for the illegal sales of jewels
que ele ganhava de presente
that he got as a present
dos príncipes sauditas.
from the princes in Saudi Arabia.
É muito evidente
It's very evident
que se tratava de propina,
that it was about tips and bribes
que correspondem ao entreguismo do governo Bolsonaro.
that was about him really giving, surrendering the government.
Era um governo anti-soberania do continente e do país.
It was a government that was against the sovereignty of the continent and the country.
Então, o primeiro desafio
So the first challenge
é isolar o bolsonarismo, que é muito forte
is
ainda.
to isolate this Bolsonarism, which is still very strong.
Para vocês terem ideia, foi o partido que mais elegeu parlamentares no Brasil, o partido do Bolsonaro.
So just so you have an idea, it was the party that elected the biggest number of parliamentaries in Brazil in the last election.
Então,
His party.
Então, agora, Lula consegue construir uma coalizão no parlamento onde ele é uma maioria consolidada.
So Lula now is managing to build a government that Lula's is the
No
majority.
parlamento, ele é maioria no parlamento.
Lula is the majority in the parliament.
Mas, claro,
But of course,
isso impõe uma série de contradições para as lutas sociais.
this imposes a lot of contradictions socially,
Porque um governo não é constituído por uma pessoa.
because a government isn't constituted by one person.
Ele é constituído por diversos partidos e forças políticas.
It's formed by many parties and political strengths and powers.
E também pela capacidade do povo de sustentar o governo.
And also by the capacity of the people to support the government.
Então, hoje, os movimentos sociais
So today the social movements
sabem que eles precisam sustentar o governo,
know that they have to support the government,
ainda com suas contradições,
even with its contradictions,
para isolar a
to
extrema-direita.
isolate the extreme right,
Mas também fazer lutas
but also to continue to fight,
para impulsionar reformas mais transformadoras.
to push forward more transformational reformations.
Mesmo nesse cenário, nós temos novidades políticas,
Even facing all of this, we still have some new things in politics,
como a criação do Ministério dos Povos Indígenas,
like the creation of the ministry amongst the indigenous people,
que conseguiu acabar com a mineração ilegal na terra Yanomami.
that was managed to stop the illegal mining in the Yanomami land.
Percebam a imagem
See this image
do governo
of a government
explodindo máquinas de mineração
exploding physically machines that were used to mine
dentro do território indígena
inside the indigenous land
e movendo todos os ministérios
and moving all the ministries
para proteger aquele povo
to protect those people
que estava morrendo de pela arma ou pela fome.
that were dying by ammunition or guns or by hunger.
Então, são coisas muito importantes.
So these are very important things.
O nosso papel,
Our role,
quando eu digo nosso, eu digo do PSOL,
when I say us, I mean PSOL, our party,
é um partido que nasceu de uma dissidência do PT,
a party that was born, nasceu,
de uma dissidência do PT. Split out.
That came out of PT, the Labour Party in Brazil,
Em 2004,
in
2005,
2004 or 2005.
hoje é dar suporte para esse governo,
Today, give support to this government,
mas pressioná-lo para a esquerda
but to pressure it to the left
e constituir novas lideranças políticas
and to establish new political leadership
que sejam capazes de dar o próximo passo
that is able to take the next steps
para garantir governos mais radicais e mais transformadores.
to ensure more radical and more transformational governments.
Porque, diferente da época em que Lula foi eleito pela primeira vez,
Because on the contrary to the time that Lula was elected the first time,
nós não temos ilusão de que reformas estruturais vão ser feitas.
we are not under the illusion today that cultural transformations are going to happen
Econômico.
and economical.
Mas, ganhando força, isolando o bolsonarismo e construindo novas lideranças,
But gaining strength, isolating Bolsonarism and building and establishing new leadership,
como Guilherme Boulos,
as Guilherme Boulos,
que a gente espera que seja o novo prefeito de São Paulo,
that we are hoping will be the new mayor of São Paulo,
nós vamos alcançar transformações mais radicais.
we will be able to reach more radical transformation.
É preciso ter paciência histórica
It's important to have historical patience
e perceber que as lutas, o principal campo de disputa
and to realize that the main fight ground
é a vida cotidiana das
is
pessoas.
the daily life that people live.
É disputar aquelas pessoas que estão se tornando conservadoras pela influência das igrejas
Those people that are becoming conservative by the influence of church,
e mostrar para elas
and show them
que não passar fome,
that not being hungry,
não viver diante de uma ocupação militar nas favelas,
not living under military occupation in the slums,
ver a retomada de programas sociais,
seeing the new social programs being happening again,
pode de fato ser algo ainda mais profundo para o futuro.
can be something much deeper for the future.
Esse é o nosso desafio
This is our challenge,
de construir um continente, uma região soberana
to build a continent, a sovereign region,
com aliança com os nossos irmãos da América Latina.
with an alliance with our brothers and sisters from South America.
Acho que é isso.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bella. And time is short, so I don't want to hog the mic, and I want to pass straight over to you guys to see if anyone has any questions. And we've got a roving mic. Cool. I'll take a few questions and then see how we go from there.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting, and I do have a couple of questions, and then I have a couple of comments. So my questions start with how do you work, or what is working, or what could work in your opinion, to continue having popular support and building on that popular support that got your governments into power throughout the ups and downs of getting into government and having to deal with opposition, having to deal with the fact that we are from Latin America, a continent that is a schizophrenic nightmare, in which half of it seems to be going forward and the other half dreams of the back times. And that applies to all of the progressive projects that happen in Latin America. And they have, some of them go better or worse than others. But then that question is for both of you that are at the moment in your respective countries. And then I wanted to say thank you, Pablo, for sharing your experience and for sharing what your position is. I also recently was back in Chile, and that is a feeling of a lot of people. That is true. But that's not the feeling of everybody. And also, I think I was talking with somebody who has been in government for a little bit. That is a meat churning machine. That's how it's called. You get in there, and it's a meat churning machine. How thick a skin are you going to have before you get absolutely destroyed by an institution and institutions that have been there and established since the dictatorship, by systems that, and a media press that is still widely dominated by the right, by, yes, a new government full of new people that have maybe not the experience, but also not the same fear of those that grew up for years in the dictatorship. And I think that's what marks the big difference, really. The fact that for a lot of us, we were born once Pinochet was out of power, and therefore we were able to dream that maybe there were better things. Like people like my mother, when Pinochet got arrested here, she couldn't believe it. Like the generation couldn't believe it that was possible. And it's a country with traumas. It's a continent with traumas. So I just like that some things like the reforms that are actually happening also were highlighted. Like the reform of pensions that is being debated right now and that the right is opposing so hard that would give people like dignified pensions. Like the copago cero, that you can actually now access some medical treatments in the place that is the birth of neoliberalism. Like when that measure was passed, thousands of women went to get like breast cancer checks and went to get like smear tests because they couldn't afford it before. So these are things happening. Like the new law that was passed, okay, like a month ago, because it's 50 years since the coup happened. The new law for finding those that disappeared. Something that the right would never even want to admit that happened. So there are fights happening. And yes, Boric has a lot to learn. But it's not just the government of Boric, it's a coalition. And we have to learn that if we get to power, we are going to have to deal with a lot of back and forth and a lot of like contradictions. Like we just need to have a look at what happened in Greece, okay, with Syriza. So just please also bring what's happening, what is good, because there are people out there that are defending Boric, because things are changing for everybody, like everyday people.
Thank you.
¿Lo digo en castellano o en inglés?
In English.
Okay.
We did with the translate.
Yeah. So there's talk of desperation. There's talk of desperation when it comes to people being pushed to their limits of oppression, limits of violence, limits of poverty, hunger, all the rest. This country is going through a pretty rough patch, if you didn't know. But I don't understand. Is there a necessity to wait until things get so bad that there's like a threshold, a breaking point? That's the bit that always gets me. We talk about the French Revolution, they didn't have any bread, and that's what got them out there. In a country like, in this country, what's it going to be like? Again, are we going to actually have to wait for things to get really bad for things to change?
Thank you. Anybody else? Because we can do a round. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think I'll go to Pablo first. In response to the question about Chile and the difficulty of governing, really, and is there your response perhaps to some of these other aspects?
All your points are completely, I think, valid. I mean, I think it's with a heavy heart yes, there are people clearly that support Boric Chile. My experience of going into the low-income neighborhoods, though, wasn't, yes, it's anecdotal. I didn't, I was there for 3 weeks, but I went to one La Victoria, and there is that apathy that has characterized Chilean society. Not apathy, anti-party apathy, that hatred of the political class, that Boric, he enthused a new generation that, as you say, perhaps weren't afraid. And I don't think it was fear there was fear that stopped a certain, perhaps, generation of trying to push. You could argue that the post-democratic governments of 1990, if you want to be generous to them, didn't rock the boat because there was a real fear that the forces of the right would. But that sometimes is an easy excuse to hide behind. Why did they embrace neoliberalism? Why did neoliberalism effectively deepen under these socialist centre-left governments? Boric is a result of a fragmentation of the left parties. It's a new party, it's a new generation, as you say. Yes, there have been some gains in Chile. They're real. The laws around not negating the coup, the policies that you talked about, the 40-hour, bringing down the working week from 40-hour, even though it's going to be staggered over 5 years, 45 hours to 40 hours. Yes, these are gains, but from the people I'm talking to, they don't see that the government is providing material solutions to the big problems. And if Boric is doing everything he can within the constraints of the Chilean system, is that I think perhaps the real question that I don't have the answer to, but it doesn't seem that for whatever reason the people I'm talking to feel that is the best you can achieve within the constraints of Chile, that's the best that one can hope for a leftist government in Chile today. So yeah, I wouldn't want to come here and say that Boric has done nothing, but I think that there's a lack of political courage. I would say you say that the new generation has courage. I would say that in the way that they've approached relations with Latin America, they've shown a lack of political courage of standing up for certain principles, of recognizing what US imperialism has done historically in the region and continues to do today, and to almost brush it off to say Allende, we on his inauguration, yes, Allende, the figure of Allende, and then to sort of demonize Venezuela as a kind of reactionary dictatorship. I understand that you can be against elements of Venezuela, but to be so far removed from the traditions of a Latin American left is troubling for me, and speaks to what I feel is a kind of a challenge, shall we say, for his government.
I'm going to ask the other two to wrap up and answer their questions. Do you want to say any final words, or you want to finish with that?
No, I think to end on a hopeful note, I think that in Chile, neoliberalism, the model that was forced on a population through state terrorism, is in crisis. Whether the far right eventually do come into power would be a tragedy. And I campaigned for Boric, even though I prefer, I wanted Daniel Jadwe, but I did everything I could, and the people that I am around did everything they could for him to come to power. So I think that Chilean society is not. I don't think it's a hopeful moment for the left. I think things are happening, but I think that the Chilean masses have moved beyond a point with the 2019 uprising, where the system will have to change, whether it's in the next couple of years or more in the medium term. But I think neoliberalism will die in Chile sooner, hopefully, rather than later.
And to Ana Maria and Bella, just to finish up as well, in answer to your questions, if you can close as well, and responding to the last two questions, do we have to wait for desperation to see change, and what could help maintain popular power? And first to Ana Maria, and we got to keep it short.
No puedo ser corta. No, mentiras. No. Me toca. Bueno, decía, y esto es, digamos, motivador, ¿no? Yo ayer estaba hablando con alguien y decía, no, aquí en mi país no hay mucho que hacer. Aquí está muy mal la situación. Estamos entre elegir en la derecha o la ultraderecha, no hay mucho que hacer. Y entonces de repente a uno se le llena el corazón de alegría porque dice, hay mucho que hacer, hay mucho que hacer, hay que hacer. Y decía Lenin, ¿qué hacer? Leámonos ese libro. Hay que hacer la tarea.
No, está bien. Well, it's motivating. Yesterday I was speaking to somebody here about, dijiste aquí, no? Yeah. Yesterday I was speaking to somebody here who said, there's not much we can do. It's a bad situation. We have a choice between the right or the far right. But in this case, there's a lot you can do. There's so much you have to do, as Lenin would say. You just have to do it. I don't know if I directly quoted Lenin then, but...
Yo por ahí lo tengo, se los puedo prestar. Solo cuando tenemos conciencia en sí y conciencia para sí. Es decir, cuando entendemos las contradicciones de clase, las vemos y somos conscientes para poder actuar en función de esos intereses de clase, podemos proyectar una tarea que nos lleve hacia un ejercicio de, digamos, de de democratización de la sociedad, pero hay que decirlo, en un sistema económico capitalista no va a ser, ¿sí? Los tres gobiernos de los que estamos hablando, los tres escenarios políticos de los que estamos hablando, pues son gobiernos en democracia. Y otra sería la historia en revolución, otra sería, ¿cierto? Y el poder popular estaría allí. ¿Cuál es la tarea entonces?
Okay, so yeah, so the important thing is that we're conscious, right? That you have class consciousness around the contradictions of class, the tensions of class, and we know and that you act in the interests of your class. We can work together to democratize society. And this capitalist system is not going to do that. The capitalist system, which has dominated our lives for such a long time, is not going to do that. But we can work in democracy and we can bring changes in democracy. None of the three governments who are talking today are revolutionary governments. They've all been, they're governments which have come into being through the democratic system, and they are making changes.
Y entonces, ¿qué nos queda? No es la desesperanza, no es la desesperanza. Por el contrario, es proyectar la política de cambio para poder visibilizar con mayor énfasis esas contradicciones, hacer evidentes los intereses de clase. Es decir, la desnaturalización de la contradicción. Estamos todavía en la lógica de que es normal y natural ser rico, ser pobre y mantenerse en esa lógica. No, hay que transformarlo. Creo que el método científico entonces de Marx nos ayudó bastante para poder comprender que es posible cambiarlo, ¿sí? Y que implica que lo veamos, porque cuando no lo vemos, cuando no lo entendemos, cuando lo volvemos parte de nosotros, pues simplemente va a quedarse allí, porque no hay nada que cambiar, ¿sí? Decía que solo sentimos el peso de nuestras cadenas cuando caminamos, no es de otra forma. Entonces tenemos que caminar, porque otro mundo sí es posible.
Okay, so, these we don't have to be desperate. These are not desperate times. What we have to do is project our ideas, visibilize that change is possible. We have to make our class interests, collective class interests, visible. And we also have to make visible these contradictions and these tensions of class, which impacts all of us. We have to end, there's a logic that to be rich or to be poor is natural. That we have to end this kind of logic, as Marx teaches us. If we don't begin to think like this and take these kinds of actions, then nothing will change. And it's Marx who said, we feel the weight of our chains when we walk, but we have to keep walking, and then we will see that another world is possible.
Quisiera cerrar con que, en efecto, para no caer en un ejercicio romántico de la transformación, sí es necesario, y estoy de acuerdo con que es necesario avanzar en políticas más agresivas de orden social. En los tres escenarios planteados, tanto conozco parte de lo que ha venido ocurriendo en Chile como en Brasil y Colombia, por supuesto, de primera mano, y si no podemos quedarnos, digamos, en tibiezas que no nos permitan avanzar. O sea, sí es necesario tener una política más agresiva que impacte más a la población, y hemos exigido, por ejemplo, con Petro, las reformas a la calle, con la gente, en el territorio, construyendo colectivamente la política pública. Eso es fundamental para que pueda avanzar el proyecto político. Gracias.
Política pública, política práctica.
La construcción colectiva de la política pública, desde los territorios, no desde arriba hacia abajo.
Yeah. Okay. So just to get, what's to bring about a romantic transformation that we look for, we need to be more aggressive in our politics. Whether in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, if we want to advance, if we want to take things forwards, we need to impact our governments and we need to drive our governments. And how do we do that? We do that in the streets. We drive it from below, in the territories, in the regions, the countryside. And that way, collectively, we construct public policy and we can begin to build the society and, the ideas that we want to build. Thank you very much.
Bella.
A América Latina é contexto de surrealismo,
Latin America is in a context of surrealism.
que nesse momento enfrenta mundo marcado por extremos.
And at this moment, it's faced by a moment marked by extremes.
É uma crise estrutural do capitalismo.
It's a structural crisis in capitalism.
E uma crise profunda da democracia.
And also a deep crisis in a democracy.
Então, esses extremos são ainda mais intensos no continente.
So these extremes are even deeper in the continent.
É por isso que uma solução puramente institucional de governos
That's why just an institutional solution in the government
não vão conseguir produzir as reformas estruturais
won't be able to produce these these structural reformations
que o povo precisa.
that people so desperately need.
Nesse sentido, eu concordo totalmente com a Maria Eugênia.
In that way, I agree completely with Maria.
Quem vai conseguir sustentar governo e impulsioná-lo para ser mais radical
The only ones that will be able to press and support the government to be more radical
é o povo organizado.
are the people being organized,
Fazer mais ocupação de terra,
taking over more land,
fazer mais ocupação de prédio nas cidades,
taking more buildings in the cities,
mas também construir soluções para a vida cotidiana das pessoas.
but also to build solutions for people's everyday lives.
Como, por exemplo, nosso movimento construiu as cozinhas comunitárias, cozinhas solidárias.
So, for example, our movement, we built these community kitchens
E transformar isso em política pública.
and change this into public politics.
É uma forma do governo
It's a way that the government,
construir, em vez de políticas públicas privadas,
instead of public-private politics,
construir políticas públicas populares.
builds política pública popular. Public politics, popular public politics.
Isso. Bom, nós hoje sabemos,
Today we know
que os movimentos sociais estão pulsantes no Brasil.
that social movements are really active in Brazil.
Lula hoje tem 60% de aprovação.
Lula today has 60% of approval.
E o Brasil está voltando a ter protagonismo internacional.
And Brazil is taking again its place internationally.
É um momento
It's the moment
para a gente construir alianças no continente
for us to build alliances in the continent
e com a esquerda do resto do mundo
and with the left and the rest of the world
para impulsionar respostas para a crise estrutural do capitalismo.
to push forward the answers for the structural crisis of capitalism.
Thank you so much to the speakers, Pablo, Ana Maria, and Bella. We can see clearly that South America, in these examples, and we could have brought others, continues to offer hope, some perhaps more than others, although that's a debate, no doubt, in the countries themselves, as well as at TWT, and of course with the contradictions and complexities that come with having power. But I think for me, what I take away as one thing that was really clear from all the examples and all the speeches, and always in these talks we want to think about the relevance to us, and that was the importance of the streets, whether it's been to defeat the far-right or right-wing governments, whether it's been to bring the left-wing governments to power, or to hold those governments to account once in power. Being on the streets has been fundamental in all these cases. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next time.